Princess Val'Rena of the Zephyrian Empire had never imagined she would owe her life to the very creature she had spent months mocking. As flames consumed the crystal spires of her palace, and her elite guards fled in terror, it was Jake Thompson, the human she had dismissed as weak and pathetic, who threw her over his shoulder and carried her through collapsing corridors and walls of fire. His scarred hands gripped her tightly as explosions shook the foundation, his human lungs burning with each breath of toxic smoke, yet he never faltered. In that moment, everything she thought she knew about strength, about power, about the fragile race called humanity, shattered like the crystal walls around them. But how did a princess bred for command and conquest find herself completely dependent on the species she had been taught to despise? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning had started like any other in the floating palace of Zephyros Prime, with Princess Val'Rena conducting her daily inspection of the human security detail with the kind of disdain typically reserved for Khand, examining insects. Her towering 7-foot frame moved with predatory grace through the polished corridors, her chitinous blue-black exoskeleton gleaming under the artificial suns that lit the palace interior. 4 arms moved independently as she gestured, 2 primary limbs crossed behind her back in a posture of authority, while her secondary arms manipulated a holographic display showing security protocols. Her compound eyes, multifaceted like cut gems, swept across the assembled guards with calculating precision. "Pathetic," she muttered in her native tongue, the clicks and whistles of Zephyrian barely audible above the hum of the palace's energy systems. Her gaze settled on Jake Thompson, the lone human among her bodyguard detail, and her mandibles clicked in what passed for a sneer among her people. The human stood at attention with the others, his 6-foot frame dwarfed by the towering Zephyrian warriors that flanked him, their own exoskeletons, bristling with natural armor plating and redundant limbs that could strike faster than most species could even perceive. Jake had been assigned to her detail 3 months ago, as part of a diplomatic gesture between the Terran Confederation and the Zephyrian Empire, a token of goodwill that Val'Rena viewed as little more than an insult. What protection could this soft-skinned, single-hearted creature possibly provide? His skin was pale from years spent in the recycled atmosphere of space stations, marked with scars that spoke of previous conflicts. But to Val'Rena, they only emphasized his species' fundamental weakness. Humans required constant maintenance, their bodies failing at the slightest environmental change, their minds clouded by primitive emotions that made tactical thinking nearly impossible. "Thompson," she said, switching to the crude human language that felt clumsy on her vocal cords. "Step forward." Jake moved with practiced precision, his military bearing evident despite the obvious disparity between him and his alien colleagues. His uniform was standard Terran military issue, modified with breathing apparatus and temperature regulators necessary for survival in the Zephyrian environment. Where the other guards wore their natural armor with pride, Jake's artificial enhancements only served to highlight his species' inadequacy in Val'Rena's eyes. "Tell me, human," she continued, circling him slowly while her secondary arms gestured dismissively, "what possible use are you in protecting someone of my status? Your reaction time is pathetic, your strength laughable compared to my other guards, and your endurance—" She paused, letting out a sound that approximated human laughter, but carried none of its warmth. "I have seen children of my species outlast seasoned human warriors in combat trials." Jake's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "Ma'am, I've been assigned to this detail based on my qualifications and experience. I've served in 3 separate conflict zones and have never lost a principal under my protection." "Principal," Val'Rena repeated, savoring the word like something distasteful. "Is that what you call me? How wonderfully diminutive." Her compound eyes rotated to focus entirely on him, a gesture that most species found deeply unsettling. "Do you know what I call you, Thompson? I call you a liability, a weak point in my security that exists solely because my father believes in maintaining diplomatic relations with inferior species." The other guards, all Zephyrian warriors bred specifically for palace protection, remained motionless, but Jake could sense their amusement. It radiated from them in subtle ways, the slight shift of weight, the almost imperceptible movement of antennae, the way their secondary arms twitched with suppressed mirth. He had learned to read these signs during his months of service, had adapted to their body language the same way he had adapted to everything else about this assignment. "Your Highness," Jake replied carefully, "I understand your concerns about my capabilities. I can only assure you that should the need arise, I will perform my duties to the best of my ability." "The best of your ability," she repeated mockingly. "How reassuring." She moved closer, her height advantage allowing her to loom over him in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "Tell me, Thompson, have you ever faced a real threat? Not your pathetic human conflicts with their crude weapons and predictable tactics, but a genuine challenge to your survival." Jake's mind flashed briefly to memories he preferred to keep buried, images of burning cities and screaming civilians, of watching friends die in his arms while enemy fire turned the air around them into a storm of death. But he kept his voice steady when he answered. "I've seen combat, Your Highness." "Human combat," she dismissed with a wave of one primary arm. "Barely worth the name. When real danger comes, Thompson, when something threatens this palace and my safety, you will do what humans always do. You will break. You will fail. You will prove that your species' reputation for courage is nothing more than propaganda designed to make the galaxy forget how fundamentally weak you truly are." The inspection continued for another hour, with Val'Rena taking every opportunity to highlight what she saw as Jake's shortcomings. She had him attempt to keep pace with the Zephyrian guards during combat drills, watching with obvious satisfaction as his human limitations became apparent. Where the insectoid warriors could move with lightning speed, striking multiple targets simultaneously with their forearms, Jake was limited to human reflexes and human reach. Where they could leap incredible distances with their powerful legs, he was bound by human muscle and bone. Where they could see in multiple spectrums simultaneously, tracking dozens of potential threats at once, he was limited to the narrow range of human vision. "Embarrassing," Val'Rena declared as Jake struggled to keep up with a drill that required participants to neutralize holographic enemies appearing from multiple angles. "Absolutely embarrassing. I would be safer with a decorative plant as my bodyguard. At least the plant would not give me false confidence in my security." But Jake endured it all without complaint, filing each criticism away and adapting where he could. He had faced worse than verbal abuse, had survived challenges that would have broken lesser individuals, and he understood that this assignment was about more than just protecting one arrogant alien princess. The diplomatic implications of his presence here extended far beyond personal pride, and he would not allow his own ego to jeopardize the fragile alliance between their species. That evening, as the palace settled into its night cycle, Jake stood at his assigned post outside Val'Rena's chambers, watching the artificial stars that dotted the ceiling of the Great Hall flicker in programmed patterns designed to simulate the night sky of ancient Zephyros. The other guards had been dismissed to their quarters, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the constant hum of the palace's life support systems. He thought about Val'Rena's words, about her accusations of weakness and inadequacy. There was truth in some of what she said, he had to admit. Humans were physically inferior to many species in the galaxy, their bodies fragile and their lifespans brief. They lacked the natural weapons and armor of races like the Zephyrians, the extended lifespans of the ethereals, or the collective consciousness of the hive minds. But Jake had learned something during his years of military service that Val'Rena, for all her breeding and training, had never experienced firsthand. He had learned that strength was not always about physical capability. Sometimes it was about endurance, about the ability to keep going when every rational thought screamed that you should stop. Sometimes it was about making the hard choices, accepting losses that others could not bear, and finding ways to succeed when success seemed impossible. These were lessons that could only be learned through suffering, through failure, through the kind of desperate struggles that the pampered princess had never faced. The attack came 3 days later, during the celebration of the harvest moon, when the palace was filled with dignitaries from across the Zephyrian Empire. Jake had noticed the increased security measures, the subtle changes in routine that suggested intelligence had detected some kind of threat. But the nature of that threat remained unclear until the first explosions shook the foundation of the floating palace. The rebels had planned their assault with devastating precision, targeting the palace's gravitic stabilizers and power cores simultaneously to maximize chaos and minimize the defenders' ability to respond. Jake felt the floor lurch beneath his feet as emergency lighting bathed the corridors in harsh red illumination, and the sound of shattering crystal echoed through the halls as structural supports began to fail. His training kicked in immediately, muscle memory overriding conscious thought as he moved toward Val'Rena's chambers. The princess would be in the great hall with the other dignitaries, participating in the ceremonial feast that marked the beginning of the celebration. The hall was 3 levels down and halfway across the palace complex, a journey that would take him through corridors now filled with panicking nobles and disoriented guards. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when he encountered Captain Zeltime, the leader of Val'Rena's guard detail, fleeing in the opposite direction with 3 of his warriors. The Zephyrian's usually pristine exoskeleton was scorched and cracked, and one of his secondary arms hung useless at his side. "Thompson," he called out in heavily accented standard. "The palace is lost. The rebels have seized the lower levels and the stabilizers are failing. We must evacuate to the emergency shuttles immediately." "Where is the princess?" Jake demanded, grabbing the captain's primary arm to stop his retreat. "Gone," Zelton replied, with a dismissive gesture. "Trapped in the great hall when the ceiling collapsed. Nothing can be done. She is already dead. Or will be soon enough. The structural damage is too severe, the fire's too intense. Even if she survived the initial collapse, the smoke and heat will finish what the rebels started." Jake stared at him in disbelief. "You're abandoning her?" "I am being practical," the captain snapped back. "The princess is dead, Thompson. Dead or dying, and there is no point in sacrificing more lives in a futile rescue attempt. My duty now is to preserve what remains of the guard detail and report this disaster to the Saker. Emperor, your duty is to protect her," Jake said coldly. "That was the oath you swore when you accepted your position." "My oath was to a living princess, not a corpse," Zelton replied. "And I will not die for the sake of appearance. You humans and your irrational attachment to hopeless causes, it is exactly the kind of thinking that makes your species so weak." With that, the captain and his remaining warriors continued their flight toward the emergency shuttles, leaving Jake alone in the corridor as another explosion rocked the palace and sent debris cascading from the ceiling above Ka. He could smell smoke now, thick and acrid, carrying with it the distinctive scent of burning crystal and melted metal that meant the fires were spreading rapidly through the structure. Every rational thought told him that the captain was right. The princess was most likely dead, and even if she had somehow survived the initial collapse, reaching her through the devastated palace would be nearly impossible. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to follow the Zephyrian guards to the shuttles and escape while he still could. No one would blame him for making that choice. No one would question his courage or his commitment to duty. But as Jake stood there in the flickering emergency lighting, listening to the sound of distant explosions and the groaning of stressed metal, he found himself thinking about Val'Rena's words from their first meeting. About weakness and failure. About humans breaking when faced with real danger. About the way she had looked at him with such obvious contempt, as if his very existence was an insult to her superior evolution. Maybe she was right about human weakness. Maybe they were inferior to the proud warrior races that dominated the galaxy. But there was something else that Val'Rena had never understood about humanity. Something that her privileged upbringing and natural advantages had prevented her from learning. Humans did not endure because they were strong. They endured because they were stubborn. They survived not because they were superior, but because they refused to acknowledge when they were beaten. Jake turned away from the path to the emergency shuttles and began making his way deeper into the palace, toward the great hall and whatever remained of the princess he had sworn to protect. The corridors grew more damaged as he descended, with entire sections collapsed and others filled with thick smoke that made breathing difficult even through his environmental suit. The artificial gravity flickered on and off randomly, sometimes leaving him weightless for several seconds before slamming him back down with bone-jarring force. He passed bodies along the way, nobles and servants caught in the wrong place when the explosions began, their elegant robes and ceremonial armor offering no protection against falling debris and spreading fires. Some were Zephyrian, their natural armor cracked and shattered. Others were from allied species who had come to attend the celebration and found themselves trapped in what had become a war zone. The heat grew more intense as he approached the great hall, the air shimmering with thermal distortion that made it difficult to see clearly. His suit's cooling systems were working at maximum capacity, but he could still feel sweat beading on his skin and his heart pounding from the combination of exertion and environmental stress. This was exactly the kind of situation that highlighted human limitations, the sort of challenge that his species' physiology was poorly equipped to handle. But he kept going anyway, driven by something that had nothing to do with rational calculation or tactical advantage. Call it duty, call it stubbornness, call it the irrational human attachment to hopeless causes that Captain Zelton had mocked. Whatever it was, it pushed him forward through corridors that grew more dangerous with each step, past fires that threatened to overwhelm his suit's protection, toward a rescue that everyone had already declared impossible. The Great Hall was a disaster zone. Its soaring crystal ceiling collapsed into a mountain of razor-sharp debris that glittered in the light of the fires burning throughout the space. The elegant tables where dignitaries had been enjoying their ceremonial feast were crushed beneath tons of fallen architecture, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of chemical fires from damaged apparate. Technological systems. Jake called out Val'Rena's name as he began picking his way through the wreckage, his voice echoing strangely in the vast damaged space. The smoke made visibility poor, and the shifting shadows cast by the flames created an environment where threats could lurk unseen until it was too late to react. He had to move carefully, testing each step to make sure the debris would support his weight, constantly aware that another structural collapse could bury him at any moment. It took him nearly 20 minutes to locate her, and when he did, his heart sank at what he saw. Val'Rena was trapped beneath a massive piece of the ceiling, a chunk of reinforced crystal that must have weighed several tons. Her lower body was completely pinned, and dark fluid that might have been her species' equivalent of blood pooled around her. Her once pristine exoskeleton was cracked and damaged, and her breathing was labored and irregular. "Thompson?" she whispered as he approached, her compound eyes focusing on him with obvious difficulty. "What are you doing here? The palace is collapsing. You should have evacuated with the others." "Can't do that, Your Highness," Jake replied, kneeling beside her to assess the extent of her injuries. "I have a job to do." She let out a sound that might have been laughter, if it had not been so weak. "Your job is to protect me, human, not to die uselessly in a futile gesture. Even if you could somehow free me from this debris, which is impossible given your limited strength, I am too badly injured to be moved. My lower carapace is shattered, and I suspect there is significant internal damage." End quote. Jake examined the crystal slab that had her pinned, running his hands along its edges to look for structural weak points or leverage opportunities. It was massive, far heavier than anything a human should be able to move, and it had settled into the debris field in a way that made simple lifting impossible. But there was something else, a crack running through the crystal near one edge that suggested it might be more fragile than it appeared. "Maybe," he said, pulling a small explosive charge from his equipment belt. "Or maybe not." "What are you doing?" Val'Rena demanded as he began placing the charge at the crystal's weak point. "Improvising," Jake replied. "Something humans are supposedly good at, according to the briefings I read before taking this assignment." "You will bring the entire ceiling down on both of us," she protested. "The structural damage is too extensive to risk any further explosions." "Probably," he agreed, checking the charge's timer. "But staying here definitely means we both die, so I figure it is worth the risk." He activated the charge and pulled Val'Rena as far away from the blast site as her trapped condition would allow, using his own body to shield her from the worst of the debris, when the explosion sent fragments of shattered crystal flying in all directions. The gamble paid off better than he had dared hope, the precisely placed charge fracturing the slab in a way that allowed him to shift the pieces enough to free her legs. But the victory was short-lived. Val'Rena's assessment of her injuries had been accurate. Her lower body was badly damaged, and she could not support her own weight when he tried to help her stand. Worse, the explosion had triggered another structural collapse elsewhere in the hall, and Jake could see new fires starting among the debris. The air was growing thicker with smoke, and even with his environmental suit's filtration systems, breathing was becoming difficult. "Leave me," Val'Rena said weakly. Take one of the emergency beacons from my equipment harness and signal for rescue once you reach safety. Tell them—" She paused, coughing up dark fluid. "Tell them I died with honor." Jake looked down at her, this proud princess who had spent months mocking his weakness and questioning his value, now broken and helpless in the ruins of her own palace. Every rational part of his mind agreed with her assessment. She was too badly injured to move quickly, too heavy for him to carry any significant distance, and the palace was continuing to collapse around them. Attempting to evacuate her would likely result in both their deaths. But as he knelt there in the smoke and fire, Jake found himself remembering something his drill instructor had told him during basic training. Back when he was young and naive enough to believe that military service would be simple and straightforward. "The time when you most want to quit," the old sergeant had said, "is exactly when you need to keep going. That is what separates soldiers from civilians, the willingness to do what needs doing even when it seems impossible." "Not happening, Your Highness," Jake said, reaching down to lift her despite her protests. "I did not come this far just to leave you here." Val'Rena was heavy, far heavier than a human of equivalent size would have been due to her species' dense exoskeleton and additional limbs. Jake staggered under her weight as he lifted her, his muscles straining with the effort of supporting her bulk while navigating the treacherous debris field. Her damaged legs dragged uselessly, and she was barely conscious, her head lolling against his shoulder as he began the long journey back through the palace. The return trip was a nightmare of heat, smoke, and collapsing architecture. Jake had to stop frequently to rest, his human endurance taxed beyond its limits by the combination of physical exertion and environmental stress. His suit's power cells were running low, the cooling system cycling on and off to conserve energy, and he could feel his core temperature rising despite the artificial climate control. Val'Rena drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, sometimes lucid enough to give him directions through the maze of damaged corridors, other times delirious from pain and blood loss. During her lucid moments, she seemed almost surprised to find herself still alive, still being carried through the ruins by the human she had dismissed as weak and unreliable. "Why?" she asked during one of these moments, as Jake paused to catch his breath in what had once been an elegant sitting room and was now a smoke-filled ruin. "Why are you doing this? You owe me nothing, Thompson. I have treated you with nothing but contempt since you arrived." Jake shifted her weight to a more comfortable position, trying to ease the strain on his already aching back and shoulders. "Because it is my job," he said simply. "Your job was to protect me," she replied. "It did not require you to die for me." "Maybe not," Jake admitted. "But that is the thing about humans, Your Highness. We are too stupid to know when we are supposed to give up." They continued through corridors that grew progressively more damaged, past fires that had spread to consume entire sections of the palace, around collapsed passages that forced them to take longer routes through areas where the structural integrity was questionable at best. Jake's legs trembled with exhaustion, and his lungs burned from breathing the filtered but still contaminated air, but he kept moving forward one step at a time. The most dangerous part of the journey came when they reached the central hub of the palace, where the main support columns for the gravitic stabilizers had been damaged in the initial attack. The entire area was in constant motion, with pieces of the ceiling falling regularly and the floor tilting at unpredictable angles as the palace's artificial gravity systems tried to compensate for the structural damage. Jake had to time their crossing carefully, waiting for brief lulls in the debris fall before making desperate sprints across open areas where there was no cover from falling architecture. Val'Rena had lost consciousness again, her weight a dead burden in his arms that made these passages even more treacherous than they would have been alone. Halfway across the central hub, Jake's luck ran out. A massive section of the upper level chose that moment to collapse, sending a cascade of crystal and metal crashing down directly in their path. He threw himself sideways, using his body to protect Val'Rena from the worst of the impact, but the edge of the debris caught his left leg and sent them both tumbling to the floor in a tangle of limbs and equipment. Pain shot up his leg from what felt like a broken bone, and when Jake tried to stand, his left ankle would not support his weight properly. Blood seeped through his suit where sharp edges had found gaps in the protective material, and his heads-up display showed warning indicators for multiple system failures. But Val'Rena still breathed, still needed his help, and the palace was still collapsing around them. Jake pulled himself upright, using a twisted piece of support beam, gritted his teeth against the pain in his leg, and lifted the princess once more. His pace was slower now, his gait uneven due to the injury, but he continued moving toward the emergency shuttles with the kind of stubborn determination that had seen his species through countless disasters and defeats. Throughout their history, "You are injured," Val'Rena observed during one of her brief periods of consciousness, her compound eyes focusing on the blood that stained his suit. "I have been worse," Jake replied, though the admission cost him precious breath. "This is insane," she continued. "You cannot possibly carry me all the way to the shuttles in your condition. You are going to collapse before we reach safety." "Maybe," Jake agreed. "But I am going to try anyway." "Why?" she asked again, the question seeming to genuinely puzzle her. "What drives you to attempt something so obviously impossible? Is it some primitive human instinct, some evolutionary holdover from your species' savage past?" Jake considered the question as he navigated around another pile of debris, thinking about the real answer to her question. It was not duty alone that drove him, though duty was part of it. It was not some noble desire to prove human worth, though that too played a role. The truth was simpler and more complicated than either of those explanations. "Because," he said finally, "someone has to." They reached the shuttle bay to find it in chaos, with emergency lighting casting eerie shadows across damaged landing platforms and the remaining evacuation craft preparing for immediate departure. The Zephyrian guards who had fled earlier were there, along with surviving palace staff and a handful of nobles who had managed to escape the collapse of the Great Hall through other routes. Captain Zelton stared in obvious shock as Jake stumbled into the bay carrying the princess, his compound eyes reflecting disbelief and something that might have been shame. "Impossible," he muttered in his own language. "She was dead. We saw the hall collapse. There was no way anyone could have survived." "Well," Jake said, lowering Val'Rena carefully onto a medical stretcher that had been prepared for other survivors, "she did." The medical team immediately swarmed around the princess, their efficient movements and rapid-fire diagnostic chatter in Zephyrian, telling Jake that she would receive the care she needed to survive her injuries. His own condition was less critical but still concerning, the broken bone in his leg requiring immediate attention, and his various cuts and burns needing treatment to prevent infection. As the medical technicians worked on both of them, Jake found himself thinking about the events of the past few hours, about the choices that had led him deeper into the palace instead of towards safety, about the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had brought them both to this moment. He had proven something today, though he was not entirely sure what that something was. Val'Rena was conscious again, her eyes tracking his movement as he was loaded onto his own stretcher for transport to the medical bay. There was something different in her expression now, a thoughtfulness that had not been there before, as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time since his assignment to her detail. "Thompson," she called out as they were wheeled towards separate treatment areas. "Yes, Your Highness?" "I was wrong," she said simply. "About humans. About you. About what strength really means." Jake nodded, too exhausted for elaborate responses. "Yes, ma'am. When I recover," she continued. "When this is over and the palace is rebuilt, I would like to learn more about your species, about the kind of strength that allows someone to carry another person through fire when all logic says it is impossible." "I would be happy to teach you, Your Highness," Jake replied, as his stretcher was loaded into the medical transport. "Though, I should warn you, humans are not nearly as interesting as you might think." Val'Rena's mandibles clicked, and what Jake had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of a smile. "I think," she said, "that I will be the judge of that." The shuttle lifted off from the dying palace moments later, carrying its cargo of survivors toward the safety of the orbital stations that ringed Zephyros Prime. Through the viewport, Jake could see the floating palace continuing its slow collapse, its crystal spires crumbling into the atmosphere below as structural failures cascaded through the ancient architecture. It would be rebuilt, he knew. The Zephyrian Empire had the resources and technology to construct a new palace that would surpass the old one in every measure of beauty and functionality. But something else had been built today as well, something more valuable and lasting than crystal walls and artificial gravity systems. Understanding had been built, forged in fire, and carried through collapsing corridors by a human who had been too stubborn to know when he was supposed to give up. Val'Rena had learned that strength came in many forms, that the soft-skinned creatures she had dismissed as weak possessed their own kind of endurance that was perhaps more valuable than natural armor or redundant organs. And Jake had learned something too, though it would take him time to fully understand its implications. He had learned that sometimes the most important battles were not won through superior firepower or tactical advantage, but through the simple refusal to abandon those who depended on you, even when abandonment was the rational choice. The medical bay of the evacuation ship was a bustling hub of activity as the surviving medical staff worked to treat the injured from the palace attack. Jake found himself lying on a treatment table next to several Zephyrian nobles, their conversations a mixture of shock, grief, and anger at the rebels who had dared to attack the symbol of their empire's power. His leg had been set and placed in a regenerative cast that would accelerate healing, and the various cuts and burns had been cleaned and treated with synthetic skin that would prevent scarring. The doctors assured him that he would make a full recovery within a few weeks, though they seemed puzzled by his body's resilience in the face of the environmental stresses he had endured. "Remarkable," one of the Zephyrian physicians commented as she reviewed his medical readings. "Your species' adaptive capacity is quite impressive. Most beings would have succumbed to heat exhaustion and respiratory failure long before completing the journey you made through the palace." "Humans are hard to kill," Jake replied with a tired smile. "Evolution did not make us the strongest or the fastest, but it did make us persistent." Val'Rena was in a more critical condition, requiring extensive surgery to repair the damage to her lower carapace and internal organs. But the doctors were optimistic about her recovery, and Jake was told that she would retain full mobility once the healing process was complete. It was a better outcome than anyone had dared hope for when he first found her trapped beneath the debris in the Great Hall. 3 days later, as the evacuation fleet maintained orbit around Zephyros Prime, while engineers assessed the damage to the palace and began planning its reconstruction, Jake received an unexpected visitor in his cold recovery room. Val'Rena entered slowly, still showing signs of her injuries but mobile with the aid of a walking support that compensated for her healing legs. "Your Highness," Jake said, attempting to sit up straighter in his bed. "You should be resting. The doctors said you needed at least another week of treatment." "The doctors say many things," she replied, settling into a chair beside his bed with obvious care. "Most of which I choose to ignore when I have more important matters to attend to." "More important than your health?" Val'Rena's mandibles clicked in what Jake now recognized as her version of a smile. "More important than avoiding a conversation I should have had months ago when you first arrived at the palace." Jake waited, sensing that she had something specific she wanted to say, and that interrupting would not be welcome. The princess sat quietly for a moment, her compound eyes focused on something beyond the viewport, where the damaged palace continued its slow orbital decay. "I have spent my entire life," she began finally, "believing that strength was about physical capability, about natural armor and redundant organs, and the ability to strike faster than your enemies could react. It is what I was taught from birth, what every aspect of my education and training reinforced. The strong survive, the weak perish, and there is no middle ground between those two states." End quote. She paused, one of her secondary arms gesturing toward the bandages that covered her own injuries. "But, lying there in the ruins of the Great Hall, unable to move and waiting to die, I began to understand that I had been wrong about many things. Physical strength means nothing when you are trapped beneath several tons of debris. Natural armor provides no protection against despair and the knowledge that you will die alone and forgotten." End quote. "You would not have died forgotten," Jake said quietly. "You are a princess of the Zephyrian Empire. Your death would have been mourned across dozens of star systems." "Would it?" she asked. "I am not so certain. My father has other children, other heirs, who could take my place in the succession. The empire would have continued without me, probably stronger for not having to accommodate my particular combination of arrogance and inexperience." "That is not true, is it not?" Val'Rena turned to look at him directly, her alien features expressing an emotion that Jake was beginning to recognize as vulnerability. What had I accomplished, Thompson? What mark had I made on the galaxy that would justify the mourning of billions? I had never faced real danger, never made a difficult choice, never been tested in any way that mattered. I was a pampered princess, playing at leadership, while real warriors like you did the actual work of protecting and serving. Jake shook his head. You are being too hard on yourself, Your Highness. Leadership is not about facing danger personally. It is about making the decisions that put other people in danger and living with the consequences of those choices. Perhaps, she conceded. But that day in the palace, when I was helpless and afraid and certain that I was going to die, I learned something that no amount of royal education had ever taught me. I learned what real strength looks like. She leaned forward in her chair, her voice taking on an intensity that Jake had never heard from her before. It does not look like natural armor or multiple limbs or the ability to see in different spectrums. It looks like a human with a broken leg carrying someone twice his weight through a collapsing building because he made a promise to protect them. It looks like someone continuing to move forward when every rational thought tells them to stop, when their own survival depends on abandoning their responsibilities. Anyone would have done the same thing, Jake said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were not true. Captain Zelton and his warriors had not done the same thing. They had made the practical choice, the sensible choice, the choice that prioritized their own survival over abstract concepts like duty and honor. No, Val'Rena said firmly. Anyone would not have done the same thing. In fact, no one else did do the same thing. Every other member of my guard detail, warriors bred and trained for exactly that kind of situation, chose to abandon me when the odds became unfavorable. Only you, the human I had dismissed as weak and unreliable, chose to risk your life for mine. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his bed, unused to being the subject of such intense scrutiny and praise. I was just doing my job. Your job, she repeated, the same way she had repeated his words months ago during that first inspection, but with none of the mockery that had colored her voice then. Yes, you were doing your job. But do you understand what that means, Thompson? It means that when everyone else abandoned their duty, you held to yours. When everyone else chose survival over service, you chose service over survival. That is not weakness. That is strength of the kind that my species has forgotten how to recognize. The conversation continued for another hour, with Val'Rena asking questions about human culture, human history, and the experiences that had shaped Jake's understanding of duty and sacrifice. She was particularly interested in the concept of self-sacrifice for abstract principles, something that seemed foreign to the Zephyrian mindset of practical survival and advancement. We have warriors, she explained, but they fight for territory, for resources, for the advancement of their clan or their empire. The idea of risking death for someone who has shown you nothing but contempt simply because you gave your word to protect them, that is something I am struggling to understand. Maybe it is hard to understand because you have never needed it, Jake suggested. Your species evolved to be individually powerful, to survive through personal strength and natural advantages. Humans evolved differently. We survived through cooperation, through the willingness to make sacrifices for the group, even when it cost us personally. And yet you are considered the weaker species, Val'Rena observed. Your individual capabilities are limited, your lifespan's brief, your body's fragile compared to most of the galaxy's dominant races. Individual capability is not everything, Jake replied. A human soldier might not be able to match a Zephyrian warrior in single combat, but human soldiers do not fight alone. They fight as part of units, as part of armies, as part of civilizations that will continue their mission, even if they personally fall in battle. Val'Rena considered this, her compound eyes reflecting the lights of the medical bay as she processed concepts that challenged everything she had been taught about strength and weakness, about superiority and inferiority among the galaxy's various species. I want to make you an offer, she said finally. When we return to Zephyros Prime, when the new palace is constructed and normal operations resume, I want you to stay on as my personal security chief. not as a diplomatic gesture or a token representative of human Zephyrian cooperation, but as the individual best qualified to protect me and advise me on matters of security. Jake blinked in surprise. Your Highness, I appreciate the offer, but I am not sure that would be appropriate. The other guards, the ones who fled during the attack, they are going to have to live with the knowledge that they abandoned their duty. Making me their superior would only make that burden heavier. The other guards, Val'Rena said with a hardness in her voice that Jake had not heard before, are no longer part of my security detail. Captain Zelton and his warriors have been reassigned to duties more suited to their demonstrated capabilities. They will spend the remainder of their careers guarding supply depots and escorting trade convoys, positions where their tendency to prioritize personal survival over mission completion will be less problematic. The implications of that reassignment were clear to Jake. In the hierarchical structure of Zephyrian society, such a demotion was essentially a career death sentence. The former guards would retain their lives and their basic status as citizens, but they would never again be trusted with positions of real responsibility or authority. It was a harsh punishment, but one that reflected the seriousness with which the Empire viewed the abandonment of duty. I will need to think about your offer, Jake said carefully. My current assignment was supposed to be temporary, and I have obligations to my own military that I cannot simply abandon. Of course, Val'Rena replied. I would not expect you to make such a decision without careful consideration, but I hope you will at least consider the possibility. I have learned much about strength and courage during our recent experiences, and I believe there is much more that you could teach me about both subjects. She rose from her chair with careful movements, her healing injury still requiring attention to avoid re-injury. There is something else I wanted to tell you, Thompson. Something that I have never said to anyone before, and that I may never say again. Jake waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say was important to her in ways that went beyond their professional relationship. Thank you, she said simply. Thank you for carrying me through the fire when no one else would die. Thank you for showing me that strength comes in many forms, and that the form I had always prized most highly is not necessarily the most valuable. Thank you for doing your job, when doing your job meant risking everything for someone who had never shown you anything but contempt. You are welcome, Your Highness, Jake replied. Though I should point out that you have shown me considerably more respect in the past few days than you did in the previous few months. Val'Rena's mandibles clicked in amusement. Yes, well, having one's life saved by someone does tend to adjust one's perspective on their capabilities. I suspect I will be adjusting that perspective quite a bit more in the coming months, as I learn more about the species I so foolishly dismissed as inferior. She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. There is one more thing, Thompson. When the official reports of the palace attack are filed, they will state that Princess Val'Rena was rescued from the Great Hall by her human bodyguard, who carried her to safety despite significant personal injury and environmental hazards. The reports will note that this rescue was accomplished after the princess's Zephyrian guards had declared her dead and abandoned their posts. Your Highness, that might cause diplomatic complications. Let it, she said firmly. Let the entire galaxy know that when the Zephyrian Empire's finest warriors failed in their duty, it was a human, a member of the species we have always considered weak and unreliable, who succeeded where they failed. Let them know that strength is not always about natural armor and redundant organs, but sometimes about the courage to keep going when everyone else has given up. With that, she left Jake alone in his recovery room, leaving him to contemplate the changes that their shared experience had brought to both their lives. The offer of a permanent position was tempting, not just for the career advancement it represented, but for the opportunity to continue working with someone who had shown such capacity for growth and change. But there were other considerations as well. Jake's assignment to Val'Rena's detail had been part of a larger diplomatic initiative between the Terran Confederation and the Zephyrian Empire, and his continued presence might serve broader strategic purposes. Beyond personal protection, the attack on the palace had demonstrated that there were forces within the Empire opposed to closer cooperation with humanity, and having a human in a position of trust and authority might help counter that opposition. More personally, Jake found himself genuinely interested in Val'Rena's continued development as a leader. The princess who had mocked his weakness months ago was clearly capable of learning and growing in ways that her royal upbringing had not encouraged. With the right guidance and experience, she might become the kind of leader that the galaxy needed, someone who understood that true strength came from the willingness to make sacrifices for others, rather than the ability to dominate through force. The next few weeks passed quickly as the evacuation fleet waited for word from Zephyros Prime about reconstruction efforts and security measures. The rebels who had attacked the palace had been identified as members of a radical faction opposed to the Empire's increasing cooperation with other species, particularly humans. Their attack had been intended not just to eliminate Val'Rena, but to send a message about the dangers of allowing alien influence into traditional Zephyrian society. Instead, their attack had accomplished exactly the opposite of what they intended. The story of the human bodyguard who carried the princess through fire when her own species' warriors had abandoned her spread throughout the Empire and beyond, becoming a symbol of interspecies cooperation and the value of looking beyond surface differences to recognize true quality. Jake received messages from friends and colleagues throughout the Terran military, congratulating him on his actions and expressing amazement at the recognition he was receiving from alien governments and media organizations. Several news services requested interviews, wanting to hear first-hand accounts of the rescue and his thoughts on human-alien relations. But the most meaningful communication came from an unexpected source. Admiral Sarah Chen, the commander of Terran Confederation forces in the sector, contacted him personally to discuss his future assignment options. "Thompson," she said during their encrypted video conference, "I have been following the reports from Zephyros Prime with great interest. Your actions during the palace attack have attracted attention at the highest levels of government, both human and alien." "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied. "I understand that there have been some diplomatic repercussions." "Repercussions is one way to put it," Admiral Chen said with a slight smile. "Another way would be to say that you have single-handedly done more to improve human-Zephyrian relations than 3 years of formal negotiations. Princess Val'Rena's public statements about your rescue and her criticism of her own guard's conduct have forced the Zephyrian leadership to reevaluate their assumptions about human capabilities." End quote. "I was just doing my job, Admiral." "So everyone keeps telling me," she replied. "But the fact remains that your job performance in this case has created opportunities that extend far beyond personal protection duties. Princess Val'Rena has requested that you remain as her security chief on a permanent basis, and the Zephyrian Emperor has indicated that he would view such an arrangement favorably." End quote. Jake had expected this conversation, but hearing it laid out in official terms made the decision feel more weighty and consequential. "What are the Confederation's thoughts on such an assignment?" "Mixed," Admiral Chen admitted. "On one hand, having a human in a position of trust and authority within the Zephyrian royal household would provide us with valuable intelligence and influence. On the other hand, such a position would be dangerous, both physically and politically. The rebels who attacked the palace specifically targeted symbols of human Zephyrian cooperation, and that would make you a prime target for future attacks." "I understand the risks, ma'am. Do you? Because I am not sure you fully appreciate the scope of what you would be taking on. This would not be a normal bodyguard position, Thompson. Princess Val'Rena is third in line for the Zephyrian throne, and her father is grooming her for leadership roles that could determine the future relationship between our species. If you accept this position, you would not just be protecting her physically. You would be helping to shape the development of someone who could one day rule an empire of billions." The weight of that responsibility was staggering, but Jake found himself thinking about his conversations with Val'Rena, about the growth and change he had already witnessed in her thinking and approach to leadership. If he could help guide that development in positive directions, the impact could extend far beyond their personal relationship. "There is another factor to consider," Admiral Chen continued. "The Zephyrian Emperor has indicated that acceptance of this position would come with certain honors and recognition that have never before been granted to a non-Zephyrian. You would be inducted into the Order of the Crystal Flame, given noble status within the Empire, and granted authority to speak for Princess Val'Rena in official capacities." End quote. "That seems excessive for doing my job," Jake said, though he was beginning to understand that the rescue had taken on symbolic significance far beyond the actual events in the palace. "Perhaps," the Admiral agreed. But symbolism matters in diplomacy, Thompson. Your actions have become a symbol of human reliability and courage, and the Zephyrians want to honor that symbol in ways that will be visible throughout the galaxy. The question is whether you are prepared to become that symbol, to carry that responsibility for the rest of your career. Jake thought about the question for several minutes, weighing the personal costs against the potential benefits to human-alien relations. It would mean leaving behind his old life, his friends and colleagues in the Terran military, his familiar routines and comfortable assumptions about his place in the galaxy. But it would also mean the opportunity to make a difference on a scale that few individuals ever achieved, to help build bridges between species that could determine the future of galactic civilization. I would like to accept the position, he said finally, with the understanding that I will need support from the Confederation in terms of intelligence, logistics, and backup resources. You will have whatever support we can provide, Admiral Chen assured him. And Thompson, for what it is worth, I think you are making the right choice. The galaxy needs more people willing to carry others through fire when everyone else has given up. The ceremony marking Jake's induction into the Order of the Crystal Flame took place 3 months later, in the newly constructed palace that had been built to replace the one destroyed in the rebel attack. The new structure was even more magnificent than its predecessor, with crystal spires that reached toward the stars and artificial gravity systems that created gardens floating in midair throughout the complex. Princess Val'Rena had recovered fully from her injuries, and her bearing during the ceremony showed none of the arrogance and dismissiveness that had characterized their early interactions. She spoke eloquently about the lessons learned during the attack, about the importance of looking beyond surface differences to recognize true quality, and about the value of allies who prove their worth through actions rather than words. Jake Thompson, she said, as she placed the crystal medallion of the Order around his neck, carried me through fire when my own people had given me up for dead. He showed me that strength comes in many forms, and that the form I had always prized most highly was not necessarily the most valuable. He taught me that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in those who are naturally powerful, but in those who persist, despite their limitations. The ceremony was attended by dignitaries from across the galaxy, with representatives from dozens of species witnessing the unprecedented honor being granted to a human. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. The message was clear that the Zephyrian Empire valued character and dedication over species membership and natural advantages. But for Jake, the most meaningful part of the ceremony was the private conversation he had with Val'Rena afterward, as they walked through the floating gardens of the new palace, while her new security detail maintained a discreet distance. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked as they paused beside a fountain that defied gravity to create spiraling towers of water in midair. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had followed the other guards to the shuttles that day?" Jake considered the question, thinking about the path not taken and the life he had left behind. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not often, and never for very long." "Why not?" Because, he said, echoing words he had spoken months ago in the ruins of the Great Hall. "Someone had to carry you through the fire, and I am glad it was me." Val'Rena's compound eyes reflected the light of the artificial suns that illuminated the garden, and her mandibles clicked in the expression Jake had learned to recognize as deep contentment. "So am I," she said quietly. "So am I." They stood together in comfortable silence, human and alien, bodyguard and princess, two individuals from different species who had found common ground in the understanding that true strength was not about natural advantages or physical capabilities, but about the willingness to make sacrifices for others when sacrifice was needed most. The galaxy was a vast and often dangerous place, filled with species that viewed each other with suspicion and mistrust, with political tensions that could explode into conflict at any moment, with challenges that required cooperation between beings who had little in common beyond their shared need to survive and prosper. But in moments like this, Jake thought, it was possible to believe that those challenges could be overcome, that the barriers between species could be bridged by individuals willing to carry each other through fire when the need arose. The story of the alien princess who mocked the human's fragile body until he carried her through fire had become legend throughout the galaxy, A tale told in 100 different languages to audiences of 1,000 different species. But for Jake and Val'Rena, it was not legend but lived experience. The foundation of a partnership that would shape the future of two civilizations and prove that strength, true strength, was not about what you could do for yourself, but about what you were willing to do for others. Years later, when historians wrote about the turning point in human-Zephyrian relations, they would point to the palace attack and rescue as the moment when two species began to truly see each other as equals, rather than competitors. They would analyze the political implications and strategic consequences, the treaties signed and alliances formed, the ways in which one human's stubborn refusal to abandon his duty had changed the course of galactic history. But they would miss the most important part of the story, the part that could not be quantified in treaties or measured in strategic advantages. They would miss the moment when Princess Val'Rena first saw Jake Thompson, not as a weak human to be mocked and dismissed, but as someone whose strength lay not in his physical capabilities, but in his unwillingness to break when breaking would have been the easy choice. They would miss the transformation of understanding that occurred in both of them as they learned to see past surface differences, to recognize the qualities that truly mattered. In the end, that was the real victory won in the burning halls of the old palace, not the preservation of one life or the prevention of one diplomatic incident, but the proof that the barriers between species were not as insurmountable as they appeared, that common ground could be found by those willing to look for it, and that sometimes the greatest strength was found in those who seemed weakest on the surface. Jake Thompson had been assigned to protect Princess Val'Rena's body, but in carrying her through fire when everyone else had given up, he had done something far more valuable. He had protected her understanding of what strength really meant, and in doing so, had helped her become the kind of leader the galaxy needed. Someone who understood that true power came not from the ability to dominate others, but from the willingness to sacrifice for them. The alien princess had indeed mocked the human's fragile body, but she would never make that mistake again. She had learned, in the most visceral way possible, that fragility was not the same as weakness, that limitations were not the same as inadequacy, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes were the ones who proved most heroic when heroism was needed most. And Jake had learned something too, something that would guide him through the years to come as he served not just as a bodyguard, but as an advisor, confidant, and friend to one of the galaxy's most powerful individuals. He had learned that doing your job, really doing it in the way it was meant to be done, sometimes required you to go far beyond what anyone had a right to expect, to risk everything for someone who might not even appreciate the sacrifice. But in the end, the appreciation had come, and with it, an understanding that would bridge the gap between two species and prove that strength, real strength, was not about what you were born with, but about what you chose to do with what you had been given. In a galaxy full of naturally powerful beings, with superior capabilities and longer lifespans, it had taken a fragile human to show an alien princess what true strength really looked like. The fire had long since been extinguished, the palace rebuilt, the political crisis resolved, but the lesson learned in those burning corridors would endure for generations to come. Sometimes the greatest victories were won not through superior force or tactical advantage, but through the simple refusal to abandon those who depended on you, even when abandonment was the rational choice, even when everyone else had already given up, even when carrying someone through fire seemed impossible. Jake Thompson had carried Princess Val'Rena through fire, but more importantly, he had carried her to a new understanding of what it meant to be strong, what it meant to be worthy of the power she wielded, and what it meant to be the kind of leader who deserved the loyalty of those sworn to protect her. In the end, that was the real rescue, not just the preservation of life, but the transformation of understanding that would echo through the halls of power for years to come.